15. Time and again. The little animal froze in a blind terror. It scuffled one way across the ledge, allowed just so far before the silver paw batted it back in the other direction. There was no escape. The cat dabbed at the dust-grey shrew again, just as time played with the hapless inhabitants of the city below. The tiny creature squealed and scuffled the length of the high ledge. The cat pounced and pinned its victim down. Its amber eyes were sharp as teeth, with narrow black slits like claws. Its paws turned the shrew over and over in the dust. The sound of tramping feet. The cat looked up from its prey. It could see nothing in the street below, but the sound was nearby. Its paws loosened their grip, and the reprieved shrew darted for a crack in the crumbling masonry. The silver cat gathered itself and sprang. It gleamed like flung mercury as it arced through the air, travelling from one building top to another, leaping beyond the bounds of any natural cat. It ran up the tilting summit of this next structure and perched on a baroque mansard shaped like an outstretched wing. Figures were moving below, guards marching as if there was no time to spare, travelling on a direct route towards the looming edifice of the watchtower. On another artery, adjacent to the first, a grey shape was cartwheeling its effortful way along. It hissed as it went. The cat's tail began to lash. It arched its back and spat at the unwelcome usurper of its world. The dark excretory trail that the creature left directly crossed the path of the oncoming guards. Ace travelled backwards, slung over the shoulder of one of the guards, and too exhausted to keep up a struggle. They seemed to have been yomping along for hours. The guard's cluster of composite eyelets rippled beside her head. It kept 12 eyes on her and watched where it was going with the other dozen. Its dark red and mandibled insect head was more like a helmet asserted over its scabrous humanoid body. Rough armoured growths encrusted the forms of all the guards, yet Ace was certain, either by instinct or intuition, that her guard, the smallest guard, was a female. They all kept up an endless chittering to each other, relaying incomprehensible messages and orders through high-speed trills and squeaks that made Ace's head reel. On a sudden shout from Vale, the group halted and the chittering stopped. Her guard waited, apparently unwilling to relieve itself of her weight for even a short time. No chance of legging it while they were busy, but she still felt like a good Barney with someone. Apart from Shonzi, she didn't much rate anyone she had met here. But Vale was the worst. His long red hair, not as red and gold as Shonzi's, and the permanent sneer on his thin, spotty face really riled her. A wimp with power. She wanted to pummel his face in. She heard him say, "If it's come back, then the process is in trouble." He was frightened. "Oi, mush!" she yelled. "Are we moving or what?" She gave the back of her guard a hearty thump with her fist. Its claws tightened around her. Vale appeared by her head. "You're worth a lot to me," he said. "You can save all of us if you listen. Go stick your head in a breeze block sandwich." "Down," he snapped. The guard released her, and she tumbled to the ground. He crouched beside her and kept his voice low. "For a long time I thought things couldn't change round here. We were all trapped in the circle. But you prove that it can be broken." "Then you'd better treat me properly." His voice hardened, and his eyes darted towards the guards and back again. "Not just me. That's why the process wants you." Ace shook out her hair. It was thick with dust. "Wanted, dead or alive. Notorious Nitro 9 Queen Ace, also known as Deadeye Dorothy. Crimes include arson, illegal use of explosives, and being rude to her mother." It was fame of a sort. She took it as a kind of compliment and understood why the doctor could secretly enjoy such notoriety. Whatever the authorities said, it was always done in a good cause. She allowed herself time for a little preening. Do I get to make demands? She said. That depends on how much you cooperate. Who with? She could guess the answer already. Vale had games of his own to play. He pointed ahead. At the junction with another street, a trail of slimy green footprints crossed their path. Do you know what that means? He asked. The slime was fresh and glistening. The process? But the process is in the tower, he said with a knowing smile. Perhaps it has family. He shook his head. There's only one process. So why don't you go and find out? She retorted. Do I get proper treatment or what? To her increasing irritation, he began to laugh, a nervous, edgy laugh accompanied by a tick of the head. You're on the blink, she thought. It means trouble, he said, and you know nothing about this place. I don't care either, Ace snapped. I want to find the doctor. And don't give me that guff about the doctor was destroyed in the beginning. I know he's here, and Shonzi knows as well. The sneer switched off his face like a change in channels, and a rage burned up in his eyes. She had never seen a rage like it, a seething rage you could almost touch. He tautened with an intensity that actually knocked her backwards. His eyes were like suns. A wave of heat enveloped her like the blast from a furnace. She felt her skin tighten and sting as if she was being burned alive. A claw pulled Vale back. He was thrown across the street and lay shaking, apparently terrified by the energy that he had unleashed at her. Looming over him, the guard captain was contorted at a bizarre puppet angle. Its claws pushed at its own armoured helmet. Leave her, warned its muffled voice. The others barred Ace's way. They squealed in anger. The captain twisted again and assumed a new and very powerful position. It seemed to stretch taller. Its eyelets agitated wildly. It turned to take in its surroundings as if for the first time. A new voice issued through its throat, cracked and ancient as if the vocal cords were being forced to create sounds they were not designed for. These alternatives. Bring them to the watchtower. The voice chilled Ace, but she was not going to panic. Vale's head twitched with fear. She saw that he was completely terrified. I give the orders, he muttered. They're meant to obey me. Ace stood up and faced the captain. You beetleheads have been looking for me, right? And you think I'm the answer to your problems? All the creature's eyelets inclined towards her. She reckoned that constituted an audience and got into her stride. So if I'm so precious to you, there's a few things we're going to get clear now. I don't think much of your setup round here. There's going to be some changes. A ripple of chittering went around the other guards. For a start, you're going to listen to what people round here want, and that means decent food and clothes for all of them. Vale looked up at her. He began to laugh. She ignored him. Under the captain's implacable stare, she could already feel her act falling apart, but she kept going anyway. And when that's sorted out, then we're going to have a little chat about... Claws were laid on them both, and experience went for nothing again. Ace was bunched together with Vale, and this time she was forced to walk as well. The captain led the way, and the two prisoners were driven on with the other guards grouped around them. How can it always work for the doctor? Next time she'd do it her way. A can of nitro had a unique diplomacy all of its own. At least they haven't got Shonzi, she added. Vale was shoved ahead by the guards, but she saw his face. Tears were streaking the dust on his cheeks like war paint. I delivered Shonzi to the tower myself. Bastard, she muttered. A whip cracked, forcing them forward. It's all sewn up, he said. We're scrubbed. What do you mean? You're an alternative to the process's plans. It thinks it's God. Anything that opposes it gets blotted out. Great, said Ace. The whips cracked, and they were forced out into the open. A vast area had been cleared to allow for the presence of one mountainous edifice. It squatted like a repulsive mechanical growth, black and immense against the blazing sky. Girders and struts jammed together like stacked wreckage, a tangled web of iron. The structure swept upwards at impossible and harsh angles in a crude scaffolding of spires and peaks. Any flesh had decayed and dropped from the watchtower long ago, but there was still movement inside the metal skeleton. Machinery clanged and squealed. Wheels, spindles, cogs, springs and pendulums turned and swung in insane and pointless industry. Ace had never seen anything so cruel and heartless. The silver line of the mercury stream flowed out from the black pit of the gate between the tower's extended fingers. From its summit came the cracked notes of the broken chimes. The guards pushed Ace and Vale onwards towards the tower. High on the buildings above, the cat observed the guards' progress. It leapt across the street again to watch another creature looping its way to the tower on a separate route. The cat mewled, running this way and that in sudden agitation. It stopped and mewled again, unable to see through the tall buildings what it also knew to be approaching. A dark figure walked the arteries of the city. It was clothed in shadow even in the broadest starlight. A robe billowed wide from its shape, but there was no wind. A circular collar rose above its head like a cowl of darkness. Thunder rumbled. The spectre glided inexorably forward like a bolt of dark mist, a gaunt terror moving pace by pace towards the grim mountain of the watchtower. The mechanisms of the tower clanked around the guards and their prisoners like a chorus of untuned anvils. The passages were walled like an open maze of iron ribcages, through which they could see the perpetual grinding motion of wheels and chains in their unwieldy matrix. Occasional swathes of slimy, web-like cocoons wound between axles and shafts. They had a dull sparkle like tarnished glitter, reminding Ace of rotting angel hair on an iron Christmas tree. She and Vale were eventually herded to the end of a passage blocked by a curving wall. The guards waited while Ace stared up at the criss-cross of girders and machines that towered above her. The Eiffel Tower had been crossed with the Victorian iron foundry and allowed to run wild. "Now what?" she said impatiently, but Vale had long since given up talking. With a jolt that made Ace yell, the floor detached itself from the tunnel and became an unsteady platform. It pivoted upwards on the rim of a vertical metal disc, carried like one of the swinging baskets on a fairground big wheel. Ace crouched low on the platform, experiencing the vertigo that she normally never knew. Beside her, Vale stood upright, taking short breaths as if expecting judgment to strike from the girders above. His voice, thin and frightened, whispered, "Don't antagonize the process. Leave the talking to me." This time Ace didn't say a word. "Oh, Professor," she thought. "Where the hell are you now?" The platform topped the disc's summit and attached itself to a level silver plate wedged like a nest between a splay of girders. It was pocked with slimy green footmarks. Ace recognized the stench. A massive red-brown arch of rippling tissue stood at the far side of the area. One footmouth reared up with a hiss, and the ring of beady eyes stared myopically at them. Vale grabbed her shoulder and pulled her forward. "Process! It's Vale Faisal. I've brought you the alternative. This is the source of disruption to the time you planned. I promised you I'd bring it." Ace wrenched his hand away. "You bastard!" The process completed a somersault and leaned its second head towards her. The circle of its mouth formed a lipless pout. Ace was revolted. She fought off a desire to run, even to fling herself off the platform to get away from the monster. "Is this the alternative?" grated the process. The monster constantly swayed with the same predatory nervous energy that Ace had seen in polar bears at the zoo. And they were supposed to be mad as well. "I found it searching for the doctor," Vale added. "Where's Shonzi?" demanded Ace. The vile head swung closer to Ace and declaimed, "The doctor. The process destroys him at the world's beginning." "Like hell!" Ace retaliated. She wondered what time the ghostly clock showed now. Was it still 11:56? "The future. It was stolen from the process by the doctor." "Good. And now you've found it again. insisted Vale. "Don't you recognise the source of the disruption when you see it?" He gripped Ace's arms tightly, his fingers pinched the skin through her jacket. The process gurgled as it leaned in still closer. She turned away her head from the stench. "This disruption, it will be cut off at its source." It arched back its head and unleashed a rasping howl of triumph which rang in the girders. "The stolen future, when it is secured, the process will be complete at last." Vale shoved Ace onto the centre of the platform. Metal clanked as the girders over the platform tilted backwards. She realised too late that both the process and Vale had moved to the edge of the area. Wheels turned as a steel spindle lowered through the opened canopy. She ran at Vale with a shout, but he sent her sprawling backwards. Above her, the spindle began to turn at a ferocious velocity. It threw out a filament of translucent thread that glittered as it fell, as fine as a single hair, but expelled at such speed that it coiled around Ace in a frantic spiral. It clung to her, stinging as it wound her in a sparkling cocoon. The cat walked through the entrance to the tower as if it owned the place. It sauntered past a sentry, ignoring the stare of 24 clustered eyelets. When the clumsy guard came lumbering after it, the cat turned and spat an angry warning. It dodged the lunging claws with the degree of elegance that only a cat can muster, and swiped at the heavy boot as it shot between the frustrated guard's legs. The cat was very particular about who picked it up. Only pilots have that privilege. Behind it, the guard was chirruping urgent messages to its comrades. The response came thundering up the tunnel to meet the intruder. Intruder? What audacity! What presumption! The cat slipped between the iron ribs. It sat, out of reach, so elegant among the clanking mechanisms of the excrescent growth that fouled its world. The guards gathered, staring through the gap, trilling in anger at their tormentor, until a sudden new presence blotted out the starlight in the main doorway. The dark apparition passed the tower's threshold. It moved unerringly forward with a terrible grace, and the guards shrank before its pall of shadow. Step by step, along the cold passages of metal bones. A black flame, an embodiment of night, invoked by the terror from which all phantoms are born. The mechanisms jolted and grated, the spindle jammed in a shower of sparks, and a startling silence fell across the tower. The thread from the spindle snapped. Ace crouched on the platform floor, trying to catch her breath through the shroud that bound her. She heard the process croak with rage. Repeatedly it ordered for the work to continue, but the machines were unresponsive. Angling her head against the tight stretch of the filament, she was able to see out across the platform. The process was swinging its head through a wide arc as if it was searching the canopy of girders above. Dwarfed beside the monster, Vale was already staring upwards at something overhead. The process saw the presence and gave an angry hiss. From somewhere there came an echo, a second hiss, deeper and more laboured than the first. Ace strained to look, but her head was held tight by her bonds. The dull clank of one single machine began to cut through the silence. Ace had crouched and spread her arms wide when the filament had started to fall. Now she was able to peel her arms free of the tight cocoon and move about a bit. The strand glimmered faintly like an endless procession of glowworms on a conveyor belt. She managed to get one hand into a pocket and pull out the Swiss Army knife. Opening the knife blade blind was a dicey business. She expected to feel it slice into her fingers. The repeated clanking sound was drawing closer. "It's coming," she heard Vale say, and the process gave a glottal croak that sounded like a choke of fear. Through the binding filament, Ace could see the girders moving again. A whole section was slowly tilting by degrees towards the platform. She found what felt like a blade against her thumb and started to ease it between the threads, but when she saw the shape that was descending, she nearly gave up altogether. A small ledge was jolting down on a diagonal wheel towards the main platform. On it stood a second creature like the process, its neck extended to observe the scene it was entering. Its features were similar, but its hide was rough and greying, unlike the sleek red-brown of the original. The fins that ran in lines along its back were stiffer and less mobile. This monster was older, but no less repulsive than the first. No, not the first. Ace suddenly remembered that this new arrival was the creature she had seen on the bank of the first city she had visited. No, that was the second city, the one in the future, where she had been first before crossing the Mercury stream into the past. The two creatures reared up and hissed at each other as the ledge levelled with the platform. Vale ducked for safety behind his slobbering master. Ace was reminded of the dinosaur movies she had seen. There was always a scene when the bikini-clad heroine was being chased by Godzilla or King Kong or a lizard with glued-on horns. It was about to munch her when another special effect monster turned up, and the two had a bout of all-in wrestling. Ace had no rock to hide behind. She didn't own a leather bikini, and she was fed up with thinking the weirdest things when she was in dead trouble. The older process arched forward off its ledge with a smooth predatoriness that she'd rarely seen in a stop-motion special effect. "I return myself," croaked the creature. It was the voice that the guard captain had spoken with. "Time disrupts." It put down its leading foot mouth and arched up the second foot from behind. "Why?" it demanded. The younger process swung its upper foot mouth around and down. The two creatures began to circle the edge of the platform, always keeping the other in opposition. Ace dared not move, glimpsing each as it crossed her limited line of vision. It was not easily apparent which process was pursuing the other. The voice of the younger process was wilder and more manic. It was attempting innocence. "Time, it has not changed. If time changes, the older process is destroyed. More worse for you." The older creature's threats were more considered, and its tirade carried far more weight. "If the older process is destroyed, then the younger process is not long-lived." They were too busy haranguing each other, Ace decided, to notice her. She set to work on the filaments with the knife. "The world city, it is left in your control. But the phasals, they are idle," complained the older. "The stolen future, it is not secured. Now disrupts." Ace saw it swing its head towards the cowering Vale. Vale bowed his head. "Process, I only obey my orders, but—" He lifted his head and Ace saw that he was looking at her. "But the cause of the disruption has been—" "Disruption, there is none," interrupted the younger process. It struck Vale with a blow with its head, which nearly knocked him from the platform. "It never learns," the monster added. The older creature peered myopically at Vale for a moment and then said, "Then what is this?" It inclined its head towards the cocoon. Ace froze, her knife jammed between the filaments. "Nothing," croaked the younger process. "Nothing." It was bad enough that the creatures could speak English. Their leaden attempts at sarcasm were all the more unnerving. "On my journey, I learn much. In the world city, I see many things in all the phases. Things the younger process is yet to learn." Its head lowered to examine the cocoon at close quarters, nearly choking Ace with its stench. "But one thing I learn, which is more important than all others." It swung back to face its protégé. "Never be away too long." The younger creature made an angry growling in its lengthy throat. "The disruption in the city, it is settled. The phasals, they continue searching for the stolen future." "Shonzi," interrupted Vale. "I have captured Shonzi." "Shonzi phasal is captured," announced the younger process, as if this were its own personal triumph. "This is still in the time you planned." "Time. Some fragments remain inevitable. The overall pattern, that is altered," argued the older monster. "The stolen future slips away. This now is not in my memories.
It has not happened before. On the middle phase of the world city, I see a new phasal creature. A female. The disruption in the city, it is already dealt with, the younger protested. It arched sideways, putting itself between the older creature and the cocoon. The other shuddered with rage. Time charted from the beginning is changed. The new phasal. It must be found and utilized, like the others. In the city there is a new rumor. What rumor? The Doctor. He will return.
Ace grinned to herself. She tried to slide her knife back inside the cocoon, but it jammed in the threads.
Impossible, declared the younger. The disruption and rumours, they are in your heads. The new phasal, it is already absorbed. There is no more disruption.
Ace jerked back the knife. The filament snapped with a fizz, and the procession of glimmering lights faded. The charge of static that held the cocoon together was broken. It fell apart around Ace. She looked up at the vile, cratered footmouth and ring of tiny eyes that loomed over her.
It is here,
spluttered the older process. From behind, the voice of the younger process cried,
Another disruption! Destroy it, quickly!
The air turned suddenly cold. The massive brute reared its head like a snake about to strike. There was a sudden cry from Vale. The creatures both turned from their prey to stare at the figure that stood in their midst. The dark figure, its cloak of shadow billowing, advancing slowly upon them. The two processes retreated before it, hissing and spitting their hatred. He seemed taller in this manifestation, but Ace still recognized the ghastly sepulchral features of the Doctor. White light reflecting from some misplaced star glinted in his staring eyes. The huge circular collar rose above his head like black wings.
Doctor!
called Ace close to tears. Doctor! I need you! She lunged at the robe, but her hand passed straight through the heavy fabric as if it never existed. The spectre ignored her cry of despair, directing the dark fury of its glare against the cowering monsters.
It returns,
chorused the processes.
Time disrupts. It comes from the world's beginning to steal the stolen future again.
Out of its ghastly robes ran the silver cat. It paused and scrutinized Ace for a second. Its eyes were like jewels. Then it darted onto the slime-covered ledge that the older process had arrived on. Festooned in thread, Ace scrambled across the platform after it. By the time she reached the ledge, the cat was already trotting up the curve of the wheel beyond. The contraption immediately levered upwards, and Ace clung to it, listening to the shrieks of the monsters below. She tried to put the Doctor behind her, but he was always there in her head. So why should he be dead? Why shouldn't there be ghosts of the living too?
Ace, he'd say with his impish smile, I can't let you out of my sight for 1 minute.
And then he'd dab the tears from her cheeks with his paisley scarf. It had to be the scarf, because the matching hanky was probably tying together two errant bits of the ever-expanding entropic universe. Who was she trying to kid? Nothing stays the same. It all disintegrates in the end. Never trust rumours. Even knots come undone and hankies get frayed. Yet something was going on, so she was going with it. Nowhere else to go. The mechanism was carrying her up even further into the Nightmare Tower, with only a wayward silver moggy for very doubtful company.